The West has always pushed the narrative that Africa is poor and needs help. Almost every article or media about Africa showcases how the number of hungry people in Africa is increasing, how the insecurity is worsening, how the number of malnourished children is increasing, and so on. There is no doubt that some of the statistics is correct, but what is annoying is how the West focuses on that aspect, which pushes the general narrative that the African continent cannot help itself and needs help, and the only people good and capable enough to help Africa is the West. This is why year in, year out since independence, Western countries have organized seminars, forums, and summits for the African continent, and according to the West, the purpose is to help. The West loves to paint themselves as saviors of Africa, but despite the amount of seminars, forums, and summits that are supposedly to help Africa, nothing has changed, and they still continue to paint Africa as a continent that needs help. So the question is, what does the West mean by helping Africa? Take, for instance, the recent visit of the United Nations Deputy Secretary General to Burkina Faso. Here we refer to the United Nations as a Western institution because that is exactly what it is. Even though it is called the United Nations, meaning all countries in the world are supposed to be inclusive, the reality is that the UN is controlled by the West and Africa is not represented, so it should be rightly called a Western institution. Now, as we said earlier, Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, recently paid a visit to Burkina Faso. This visit is part of a broader tour that also includes Senegal, Guinea, Mali, and Nigeria. So, what was the purpose of her visit? According to the UN, her tour is a critical component of a broader strategy aimed at reinforcing support for the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and addressing the multifaceted crisis that plagues Burkina Faso and its neighbors. According to the general report, the political and humanitarian context in Burkina Faso is dire, and Burkina Faso is suffering from political instability, armed violence, as well as escalating security concerns. This instability has in turn led to widespread displacement and food insecurity, as well as a breakdown in essential services. So, the UN's Deputy Secretary's visit serves as a vital touchpoint for the UN's effort to stabilize the region and advance its development agenda. In simple terms, she came to offer a helping hand to Burkina Faso. But the question is, how is this visit different from the countless other visits paid by the UN, Western institutions, and Western countries to Burkina Faso and other African countries? The fact is, it is not. These people organize these forums, summits, and visits, and end up pledging to do this and that, but at the end of the day, nothing comes out of it. There are no tangible results to be seen. Instead, the West leaves these meetings getting something beneficial. It's why during the Italy-Africa summit held earlier this year, the chairman of the African Union said that Africa is tired of hearing pledges from the West. He said, "The leaders will only take them seriously if the West starts taking action." Sometimes, it seems these Western countries organize summits in Africa or pay a visit to Africa to improve their global status, as well as show that they are superior and better. It has never been to help. In addition, these summits are organized to get something out of Africa, which most times African leaders freely give in exchanges for personal gains. Think about Burkina Faso and other countries in Africa dealing with insecurity. The West offered to help these countries by sending in their military and setting up bases in those countries in the guise of helping them fight the insecurity. However, none of these countries, despite the help from the West, have successfully dealt with the insecurity. Instead, the statistics showed that it got even worse after the West offered to help, which has made many conclude that the West might be the instigator of the insecurity in the first place. Defenders of Western countries might say, but the West have been sending financial and humanitarian aid to Africa since independence. Well, they are right. For almost half a century, the countries of Africa have been awash in aid with hundreds of billions of dollars given to African governments. In fact, according to a 2014 report, the African continent receives about $133.7 billion each year from official aid, grants, loans to the private sector, and remittances. Imagine if this staggering amount of $133.7 billion were actually invested in the continent every year. Africa would certainly not be the way it is now. The Commission on Africa, established by British Prime Minister Tony Blair, sought to raise $50 billion a year on the international capital markets, which would be used to reverse Africa's economy. In July 2005, Blair made aid to Africa the centerpiece of the British presidency during the G8 meeting in Gleneagles, Scotland. 4 years earlier, in 2001, U.S. President Bush tripled aid to Africa to $4.3 billion. In addition, his administration planned to boost grants to poor African countries. Back in 1985, the United Nations held a special session on Africa to boost aid to Africa, which resulted in the UN launching a $25 billion special initiative for Africa in 1996. And between 1960 and 1997, it was reported that more than $500 billion in aid was pumped into Africa. From all these accounts, it would seem that the West truly wants to help Africa, but the facts don't lie. Western aid has been a failure and will continue to be a failure. Do you know why? It's because Western aid has led to corruption in Africa, increased dependency on the West, and is a tool of Western exploitation. You see, if Western aid was to stop today, the African masses would not even notice. Do you know why? It's because the aid doesn't get to them in the first place. Instead, all those $1 billion worth of aid goes into the pockets of African greedy politicians. Records have shown that when aid comes into an African country, a major portion of the fund is diverted into the personal accounts of greedy African politicians who either use the funds to sponsor elections or store them in bank accounts outside Africa. Now, since some governments were always looting the aid fund, some aid donors, such as the United States, decided to channel the funds to Africa through NGOs. But that didn't solve the problem. People began to see NGOs as a source of wealth, and so began the proliferation of NGOs in Africa. In 1960, there were only 10 registered NGOs in Ghana, but by 2001, the number had increased to 1,300. Imagine how many there are now. And it's not just in Ghana, it's the same all over the African continent. But guess what? The donors of this foreign aid, such as the World Bank, the EU, and Western countries, are aware that substantial amounts of the aid end up in the pockets of greedy African leaders and NGOs, but yet they still continue to give the aid and consider them as partners in development. If they truly wanted Africa to develop, wouldn't they have figured out another way to help the continent? Why do they still keep on pumping aid every year when it's obvious that the aid is not doing anything? It's obvious that they are getting something from it. And this brings us to our next point. Western aid is a tool of Western exploitation. Recall that 2014 report where we said that Africa receives about $133.7 billion each year. This amount is massive, right? But listen to this. The report included that $191.9 billion is extracted from the continent in the form of debt repayments, multinational company profits, and illicit financial flows. Mind you, this is just for 2014. The figure is reportedly higher in most recent times. Speaking about illicit financial flows, the general idea is that corrupt African leaders are responsible for looting major public funds in their countries and keeping them in private offshore accounts. But that idea has been challenged by a recent report. According to estimates by Global Financial Integrity, corrupt activities such as bribery and embezzlement of public funds constitute only about 3% of illicit outflows. Criminal activities such as drug trafficking and smuggling make up 30% to 35%. But guess what takes the major part? Foreign MNCs. These guys take a whopping 60% to 65% of illicit outflows according to the report. So can you see that money stolen by corrupt governments is insignificant compared to the money looted by Western companies? From the report, it has been reported that the most common way illicit money is moved across borders is through international trade. Based on the 2014 report, it means Africa suffers a net loss of more than $85 billion every year. Such a net outflow suggests that far from the West aiding Africa, it is Africa that is aiding the West. In the same way that Africa is helping to develop the West, it's the same way that the West is helping to underdevelop Africa using aid. Most of the aid funds given to Africa by the West come with conditions. Some of these conditions include allowing foreign multinational companies to set up their companies in Africa, giving them access to exploit our resources. The fact is that the African continent has been a net creditor to the rest of the world for decades, while its people suffer under the so-called aid given by the Good West. However, Africa doesn't need help or aid. The fact is, aid has done more harm than good to Africa. It has made Africa to be seen as a helpless continent that cannot do anything to help itself. But it's time to change this. Africa can do without foreign aid. If there was no aid, Africa would be forced to find ways to create revenue by itself. It would force Africa to produce and trade with fellow African countries. It would force Africa to improve on infrastructures. When there is no free food that will be sold at low prices, farmers will have to go to the farm. Africa will not fizzle out without aid. Instead, Africa will come out stronger. It's time for Africa to stop receiving foreign aid and seek to create partnerships with countries based on mutual benefits. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.